who has joined us for today's webinar. I trust you can all hear and see us loud and clear. My colleague Catherine here is monitoring if that isn't the case. Welcome. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia, and we're a specialist crisis management consultancy. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them do and say the right things on the worst days of their business lives. And really our passion in doing that is to help organizations avoid the needless harm caused by a crisis. And when we look from the outside in at crises, we often see successful, admired businesses making mistakes which harm not just them in crisis, but also harms the stakeholders who are affected by their actions or sometimes inactions. And it can be sometimes hard to understand why that happens. You know, these successful, admired businesses, they are led by experienced, intelligent, professional, senior executives. So why is it on that most challenging day of their business lives that sometimes leaders falter and their businesses and their stakeholders suffer as a result? Well, I guess the answer is quite obvious, because a crisis is literally an extraordinary event, and it brings with it pressure, stress, limited information, high stakes, and an intense spotlight from stakeholders, not least the media and your own people, and high risk for those individuals who are responsible for responding, high personal risk if they get it wrong. So you can imagine that under those circumstances, the amygdala starts pulsing, the adrenaline starts flowing, and it's very easy to simply begin reacting to events or just responding by pure instinct. It could also, of course, be that they haven't got a plan or they haven't rehearsed that plan, but ultimately it is what those leaders do and say and the decisions that they take on that most challenging day which will determine their personal fate, the fate of the organization, and the fate of those affected by the crisis. So ultimately, crisis management all boils down to decision making made by human beings under intense pressure. And I think that's why there's been so much interest in today's webinar. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Mark Schofield. Mark has really great experience in this area. And we're going to be talking, or rather Mark's going to be talking about heuristics and cognitive biases and plot spoiler. They're not the same thing. And those two elements, cognitive biases and heuristics, there's part of that that can be unhelpful in a crisis, part of it that can be really extremely helpful in a crisis. So understanding a little bit more about that, understanding what happens to us under extreme stress and pressure, I think is a really insightful and useful bit of learning for all of the people on this line who are involved in crisis management. So Mark, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your background, then I'm going to hand over the mouse and control of the presentation to you to talk us through cognitive biases, decision making and heuristics in crisis. And for everyone on the line, we will take questions, but if you can post them in the questions box on your screen, and then there'll be 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Mark and I to respond to those questions. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to talk to you all today, because so often in the various different industries, companies that I work with, I find that human behavior is really not at the kind of forefront of how people think about their business. It's a sort of afterthought. And I find that very frustrating. And so it's great to have the opportunity to talk about behavior. I am a behavioral scientist. 30 that wasn't always the case. I trained initially as an economist, and my first jobs were in the econometrics world, building predictive models and forecasting tools, predominantly for financial markets. And during that time, I became fascinated with two observations. The first is that so many of the models and tools that people use are wrong. And not just wrong, sort of randomly wrong, but consistently making the same mistakes, the same errors. So you could observe and see these errors in the models. And secondly was that when you look at decision-making in financial markets, whether it's investors or traders or analysts, we see these consistent patterns. You get these sort of boom and bust type cycles where we see the same mistakes being made over and over again. So I became fascinated by the human component of decision-making and studied it intensively. I went back to school and did a master's in behavioral science. And ever since then, that's been the direction my career has taken. Initially looking at decision-making in markets and economies, but then progressing through to what I do today, what I've been doing for the last sort of 10 or 15 years, really, which is looking at behavioral and decision-making processes in organizations. So that's my background. What I'm hoping to do today, Jonathan, I think I need control on the slide deck, if you could. So I can just move to the slides.
I think you have control, Mark, but if it's not working, then please do shout.
Yeah, got it. And what I'm going to do today, Jonathan has already given us a really good just sort of oversight of the sort of stress type scenarios that we get into in a crisis and how that can impact decision making. So what I'm going to do over the next sort of 40 minutes or so is to try and deconstruct the decision making process, break it down into its fundamental parts so we can understand how we actually make decisions. Have a quick look then at why those decisions go wrong. And then we're going to try and rebuild the decision-making processes in a way that will give you a framework to think about as you look at your own crisis management and decision-making processes in your organizations that will hopefully yield much more consistent, more robust decision-making outcomes. So let's kick off then with how we make decisions. This response of the machine is very, very slow. There we go. Over the last 200 to even 300 years, decision theory has been really completely polarized between two distinct models. On one hand, we've got the economic model, and it holds that we're all rational beings, that we assimilate information, we assess that information, and then we make our decisions, we select the options, the choices, which will give us the best outcome. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, we've got the psychological model. And that holds that our decisions are driven by emotions, and that those emotions are shaped by our nature, by a combination of learned and copied behaviors that we assimilate over the course of our lives, and also by the context or the environment that we sit in. Now, as is obviously often the case when you've got quite polarized sort of academic schools of thought or views, the real world, the reality, actually sits somewhere in between them. And that's where the kind of behavioral or cognitive model of decision-making sits. The behavioral model holds that we are fundamentally rational. And if you think about that, it makes sense. We couldn't possibly have evolved as we have. The human race could not evolve to where we are today if it wasn't somewhat rational. And when you think about the whole evolution of computing, of machine learning, of AI, of all sorts of digital modeling, where it's based on sort of ration and logic, we couldn't have done that. We couldn't have created that unless we were fundamentally rational. But the decisions we make are affected by a number of factors. They're affected by the complexity of the decision we're making, by resource constraints. That might be time. We just have to make a decision and we don't have any time at all to do so. We don't have time to do the analysis. It might be the resources we need to conduct that analysis. And they can be affected by information issues. It may be that we have too little information with which to make a decision. It could be that we have too much information to cope with, to process in the time available. Or it could be that the information is flawed or wrong, misinformation. This concept of constrained or bounded rationality was pioneered by a brilliant chap called Herbert Simon, working in the 1940s and 50s. A really interesting chap, and I do recommend, if you've not come across him, looking him up. A polymath, really, who was active in economics, in psychology, really was at the forefront of computational studies, and a lot of his work feeds directly into what we now know as AI. A brilliant guy. He created this concept of bounded rationality. And Simon argued that when we are faced with an intractable decision problem, a problem that's too complex or we haven't got enough time or resources to make that decision, we resort to simple rules of thumb or shortcuts to help us make those decisions. And he called these heuristics. So heuristics are effectively decision-making shortcuts. They're algorithms for the brain, if you like. He gave a couple of examples. Satisficing, which is where we look at a problem. We perhaps have not enough time to make the decision. We're under time pressures. We've got a lot of analysis to do, which we can't do in the time available. And so we simply select the first option that we come across, which appears to be satisfactory, rather than selecting the optimal solution. Another approach that we take that he identified was simplification. Simplification is where we look at a very complex situation or decision problem, and we don't quite know how to deal with the complexity. So we simplify it by creating a much more basic or simple underlying mental model on which to make the decision. The study into heuristics was then developed further by a number of different people. Most notably, I suppose, or most famously, Daniel Kahneman, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, and his colleague Amos Tversky. And they set about documenting heuristics, identifying as many specific ones as they could. Kahneman and Tversky highlighted or catalogued, if you like, 3 really critical decision-making patterns that we see right across the whole spectrum of human decision-making. The first is anchoring. Anchoring is an adjustment process where we start with an anchor, a fact or a number or a piece of information that's available to us that we know about, and then we adjust or iterate from that. So, for example, imagine a situation in which we have a problem to solve. We've got a bit of a crisis, and I ask you to tell me how long it's going to take to implement the solution. You're going to look at the situation. It's a little bit different. It's not something we've seen before. So you're going to search in your memory for something that seems like a similar problem that's been solved. You're going to look at that and say, well, how long did it take us to fix that issue, to apply that solution? It was about 6 weeks. And then you'll look at the problem we're facing today and say, okay, this seems a little bit more complex, a few more variables at play here. So it's going to be 8 or 9 weeks. Anchoring and adjustment is an incredibly powerful heuristic. When I teach forecasting, adjustment tools are one of the fundamental building blocks that we use in building more accurate forecasting models. The second heuristic they identified was availability. Availability heuristic describes how when something comes easily to mind, when we find that it springs into our mind, we find it easy to kind of picture or imagine, we ascribe more importance to it if it's a factor or an input in a decision, or we potentially view it as more likely if it's a potential. If we're looking at scenario planning, forecasting potential outcomes, we see it as being more likely. The availability heuristic, the way to think about it, I guess, is that it's kind of like a search process or a search engine operating on a database. Approximately 5% of our life experience, everything that we've seen, heard, read about, experienced over the course of our lives, about 5% of that sits in our conscious memory. The other 95% sits in our subconscious memory, and we're not aware that it's there. The feeling of availability, that sense that something comes readily to mind, is sort of a tagging process within that database. So it's our brains telling us that somewhere in our experience, we've witnessed something similar. So availability heuristic isn't just some sort of random feeling of intuition or sixth sense. It's actually a really powerful tool that says, yeah, okay, we're looking at a situation. We can't understand why we recognize it, but we kind of feel like we do. And there is probably a reason for that. Obviously, once we use availability, then we ascribe more importance to those factors, and we tend to weight those very heavily in our decision-making processes. Representation or representativeness, as Kahneman labeled it. This is where we paint a picture. It's like a sort of pre-planning process. It's like creating a sort of blueprint or drawing a map of where we're going. And again, it is a powerful heuristic. Machines are fabulous at analyzing data, cataloging it, searching it. They're incredibly good at interpolating between data points, either in a straight line or in a pattern that's been sort of pre-programmed into it. But they're not as good as the human brain at sort of filling in gaps, at sort of creating kind of cognitively imaginative gap fillers. And the representativeness heuristic or representation heuristics do exactly that. So they allow us to create a mental image of what we think an appropriate solution or an appropriate outcome looks like. So these are all great, these heuristics, they all sound good. Kahneman and Tversky, though, as well as categorizing, wrote an awful lot about how these heuristics can go wrong. If we think about the anchoring heuristic, for example, it's a great tool so long as the anchor is correct. We know that that anchor is right. And to give a good example of an experiment that was done, a group of participants were brought together, and half of them were asked to say whether they felt, whether they believed that Mahatma Gandhi was younger or older than 9 years old when he died. The other half were asked to say whether he was younger or older than 140 years old when he died. Now, obviously, everybody got it right. The anchors are so ludicrous and so obviously wrong that people were able to give the right answer. But then they were asked to estimate exactly how old they thought he was when he died. The people who were given the anchor of 9 years old guessed that he was about 40 years old, and those who were given the anchor of 144 guessed that he was nearer 70. So same questions, same process, different anchors, and we had this huge variation in the outcome of the estimation. It shows you just how far anchoring can take you wrong. Now, what's interesting about that study is there's also a sense of availability and representativeness going on as well. Because the answer to the question is he was actually 78 years old. But because we have this mental image of this dynamic, driven, passionate leader, we picture him as being younger than he actually was. So the availability piece of that is him in his prime, it's him in his youth. We don't really think about him in the lead up to his death. So huge bias that can come into these heuristics. Now, part of the problem with heuristics is that the work that Kahneman and Tversky did in particular, and I'm going to come down a little bit hard on them, is fabulous. The book's Thinking Fast and Slow is a great read. It presents a really compelling picture of the way heuristics could go wrong, and the stories it tells, the judgments that people make are intensely sort of memorable, and the availability heuristic sticks in our minds. It kicks in, and so we get this idea in our head about heuristics causing decision errors. So we do need to clear up a few myths, if you like, about heuristics. The first one is that heuristics are not intrinsically good or bad. They are just a set of rules. Just like algorithms, they are dependent on the data that you train them on, that you feed into them. So you put in the wrong data, you will get the wrong outcome. If you feed in good information, you will get a good outcome. So heuristics are not intrinsically good or bad. The second thing is that heuristics are not cognitive biases, and nor do they cause biases. So if you hear people talking about the anchoring bias or the availability bias, it actually means they don't really know what they're talking about. They don't really understand the topic. Heuristics are susceptible to cognitive biases. So these judgment rules, these judgment decisions can be skewed by cognitive biases, but they're not the same thing. So if they're not intrinsically good or bad, if they're not biases, if they don't cause biases, why do we care so much about them? And the answer to that is simply that heuristics are absolutely vital for effective decision making. And in some instances, they can actually yield better results than analytical decisions. It's estimated that we make approximately 40,000 decisions every day. If we spent 2 seconds analyzing each of those decisions, we wouldn't have time in the day to take a single action on the back of those. We wouldn't actually be able to do anything. So we need to have heuristics in place in order to get through, to spend more time, to be able to develop the sort of analytical processes that we need for high stakes decisions. As I say, in some instances, they can even yield better outcomes. I'm not going to kind of go into a lot of detail right now because we don't have a huge amount of time, but there's a fabulous body of work by a guy called Gary Klein, who's an American decision expert. Well worth just looking into some of the work he's done with people operating in really high stakes, high pressure environments, and how what they believed was a sort of intuition or sixth sense that allowed them to make some sort of really effective decisions under pressure were actually, when they analyzed it, heuristic processes. If we have some time at the end, I can expand on that a little bit. But heuristics are vital for decision-making processes. So when we start to rebuild our decision toolbox, what we're going to be doing is looking at how we create effective decision-making tools, how we create heuristics that are robust under pressure. So if heuristics and heuristic decision pattern making doesn't cause judgment error, doesn't cause biases, what does? Where do biases come from, and why do decisions go wrong? To begin with, we need to make a clear distinction here between the type of judgment error we're talking about. On one hand, we have random errors, and this is where we've got a series of outcomes to a decision, if made time and time again, produce different results, scattered results, with no discernible direction of error. They're just all over the place. On the other hand, we have systemic biases, and this is where we get tightly grouped. We get consistency in the responses to the decision, but there's a deviation in those responses from the optimal decision. So there's a directional bias that we can see. It's observable. And it's an important distinction to make when we think about things, particularly like crisis response and crisis management. For two reasons. First of all, with random error, there's not a lot we can do about it, actually. We can't predict random errors because they are random. And secondly, that random error, if it's genuinely random, if there isn't a systemic bias in there, tends to be somewhat mean reverting. And so if you look at errors made over a period of time, very often you end up, when you sort of average those out, with a sort of relatively accurate response. With systemic biases, on the other hand, they are not random, they're not scattered, and the deviation from the correct outcome is consistent. And when you get the pattern we see in the target on the right, with these tightly packed responses, it creates an illusion, it creates an image of precision. And when we see responses to a decision question or to a challenge that are consistent like that are closely grouped like that, we tend to believe that the process that we're using to make decisions is accurate because it's consistent. And so we embed the bias into the system. We see this time and time again with financial modeling. They call it an error residual or a model residual. And people then just either to try and make a bit of an adjustment for it, or they ignore it completely. Now, the problem with human nature is that we like to believe that we're rational decision makers. So very often, what we do when there is a bias embedded in the system is we move the target rather than adjust the decision tool. So systemic bias is what we care about here, and they can be mapped, they can be measured, and they can be mitigated. So what actually are the reasons then that decisions go wrong? Why do decisions go wrong? A number of factors. The first is a set of evolutionary survival mechanisms that we have in place. Now, these are heuristics. They are examples of heuristics that have gone wrong. Our database, which has built up over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, hasn't evolved, whereas the environment in which we're making decisions has evolved very, very rapidly. So a lot of these survival mechanisms are based around survival. It's the fight-flight type response. Their survival mechanisms evolved over the history of the development of human cognition. Now you say, well, hang on, physical threats haven't really been the sort of big issue for many, many years now. So why have we not been able to do that? To give it a little bit of context, if you go back 150 years, a lot of common illnesses that we ignore today, we might take a paracetamol or something, but not much more than that, 150 years ago might have killed us. If we upset somebody or insulted somebody in the street 150 years ago, they might have challenged us to a duel. We could have ended up dead as a result of a conflict or as a battle. And when you think about that 150 years in the sort of history of cognitive evolution. Unlearning that is effectively like trying to unlearn every piece of behavior, every emotional response that we've developed over the course of our individual lives in about a day and a half. So they're still very hardwired in there. And those preferences fall into three categories. Time preferences, where we hugely overstate the importance of events, of anything that's in the present relative to the future. If a good example of that, I suppose, would be if we think about the pain of going to the gym. We overstate how painful it's likely to be to go and work out in the gym, and we underestimate the long-term value to our health because it's intangible, because it's somewhere in the future. We don't see that immediate impact. And at the same time, if I think about the pleasure of going to my local cafe and eating a huge slice of cake, I overstate that pleasure and the amount of satisfaction I'm going to get from it. And I underestimate the impact it's going to have on my waistline at some point in the future. Now, if you combine those two together, you can see why people find it so hard to stick to health programs. And the second set of preferences are around risk, loss aversion. We are hardwired to try and avoid losses. Understandable when the loss could have been fatal, it could have been loss of life. But we still see it today, and you can try this experiment on people, very, very simple. If you ask somebody to select between two bets, they can picture whichever one they like, a flip of a coin. If it's heads, you win £100, and if it's tails, you lose 50. The second bet, flip of a coin. If it's heads, you win 25. If it's tails, you lose nothing. Everybody will pick the second choice, but the economic value of the first one is double what the second one is. So if you ran that twice, if you got a head and a tail, you'd expect to win £50, 100 win, 50 loss, as against 25. But nobody will select that possible potential loss, despite the fact that it's economic the best outcome. The third set of preferences are then social preferences. We're hardwired to try and remain within our social groups. We don't want to be expelled from the group. And that means that we end up with behavioral patterns, with behavioral interactions come out of there, geared to social acceptance, geared to being a part of a group. So people will say whatever they need to say to remain in the group, to keep consensus, to avoid conflict. And these preferences are what have led to most of the cognitive biases that we know about today. Now, if you Google cognitive biases, you'll find hundreds. Some of them are actually heuristics, not biases. Some of them are just different names for the same sort of thing. But there are certainly a lot of them out there. We haven't got time to go through them all today. I've just put a couple here on this slide, but I just wanted to pick out 3 or 4 of these that I think are particularly relevant to the crisis management environment, the crisis response world. First is the bystander effect. This is a very well documented bias, and it says that in any kind of emergency situation or incident situation, the more people there are in attendance, the less likely anybody is to actually do anything. If there's an accident in the road and one person witnesses it, that person will almost inevitably try and assist. They'll try and go in and see what they can do, try and help. Once you get to 5 or 6 people witnessing, more often than not, nobody will do anything. And it's a mixture of sort of loss aversion around sort of, could I make a mistake? Could I be held responsible if I get in there? Maybe there's somebody else in the group who's better qualified than I am. but it's a very common one in crisis situations. So when you have a crisis situation, when you're dealing with a crisis, getting too many people together on a call in a meeting can sometimes be counterproductive. You've got to be very careful that it causes people to step back. Another one is shared information bias. Some very powerful experiments around this. If you sit a bunch of people around a table and you give them all some common information pertaining to a challenge or a decision task, and then you give each individual a unique piece of information and something they know that is unique, which is relevant to the decision task, and sit back and watch what happens. The group will spend 95% of its time discussing the shared information. So people hold back information they know is relevant, they know is unique to them, and again, this is a sort of loss aversion type with a sort of discounting effect in there. They'll hold it back because they don't want to offer something up that may make them sound stupid. What if I'm wrong? What if I haven't understood it? Okay, I've been given this piece of information, but surely somebody else should know about this. Why hasn't somebody else said it? So again, in a crisis situation, very often you'll find in a group, you have people there who have knowledge, who have skills, who have information, which could present new options or innovative solutions to a challenge, and they won't share it. People will stick with the tried and tested. Attribution errors, another one. Attribution errors are based around our kind of perception of ourself, really. An attribution error goes along the lines of, when I make a decision and the outcome is successful, it's because I'm brilliant. When I make a decision and the outcome is not successful, it's a failure, it's down to bad luck or the environment that I was making the decision in. It's an external factor, it's not down to me. It gets more complicated because I then look at other people and I flip it around. So when they make a decision and the outcome is good, I think it's down to luck. And when they make a decision and the outcome's not so good, I think it's because they're stupid. And what the attribution error does, it means that when we get a positive outcome that comes about through chance, through good luck, we attribute it to our own skill or to the effectiveness of our decision processes. When we get a bad outcome from a good decision process, just due to chance or bad luck, we discount that process and we change the process. So attribution errors stop us from learning from our mistakes. The second big factor around error then is information overload. There's a fascinating study done by two characters called Tuning and Harrell, and they gave people steadily more information, more cues towards a decision task. And what they found is, as they gave them extra information, people employed more cues in their decision process until they got to about 7. From then on, it didn't plateau, but actually people started using less information. And once you'd given somebody about 11 or 12 cues or pieces of information to make a decision, they were so information overloaded, they only used 1 cue. I replicated this task, not looking at information usage, but looking at analytical processes. And I did it in the real world with about 700 financial market investors and traders. And we gave them an iterative task to do in which the accuracy of the forecast they were making could be improved with each adjustment step using adjustment forecasting processes. And then we gave them information alongside of that they could use to feed in. And we saw exactly the same pattern. What we saw is that initially people would tend to make about 4 or 5 adjustments to their forecast with the additional information, which would give them a pretty tight band within which to make the forecast, pretty effective decisions. Once we were giving them 8 or 9 pieces of information to use, they were only using 1 iteration. So they were effectively just using some gut feel and a first guess. The final reason decisions go wrong, decision traps.
Two things. One, to give you a time check. We've got about 10 minutes until questions. And 2, just to remind everyone on the webinar, if you'd like to pose a question, do so via the question box, please. Thank you. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you. Okay, I better just speed through this a little bit. So decision traps, this is just a really handy tool, really. There was a study done, it's actually in the world of extreme backcountry skiing and avalanche risk by some PhD students in Canada. And it's something I came across because I do a lot of work in that field as well. It's a personal interest of mine. And what I've found is that their study translates incredibly well to the world of business. It's a really handy checklist. They found that 98% of serious incidents that they came across, serious accidents, could be attributed to human judgment errors. And they found that of that 98% of decisions, they could almost entirely be categorized into 6 simple heuristic errors. The first was familiarity. So that's simply saying we've always done it this way. We're familiar, this is the way we've done it in the past, we're going to do it this way again, and it's not taking into account changes in the context. The second was acceptance. I don't think this is a good decision, I don't think this is what we should be doing, but I don't want to say so because everyone else in the group seems to be happy with it. Third is continuity. We started out on this path, we had a plan, we've got too much invested in the plan now, we're going to stick to it. We might be able to adapt the plan slightly, but we're not going to abandon it. The third, the expert halo. Now this is a really fascinating and a really important one, actually. There's another cognitive bias, something you may have heard of, called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what it says is that once people have a small amount of knowledge, their confidence in their knowledge and ability increases disproportionately. So they become overconfident. As people gain more knowledge, they start to realize how much else there is to know about a subject. They start to realize not just what they do know, but what they don't know, and they become underconfident in their decision making. So very often in a group situation, the loudest people are the people with just a dangerous small amount of knowledge. The problem is that when we observe people talking confidently who sound like they know what they're talking about, we perceive them to be experts. So the expert halo is a situation where you've got somebody with a sort of dangerously small amount of knowledge and a dangerously loud voice taking up too much of the conversation. Tracks, very simple. In skiing terms, it's following the tracks because somebody else has skied down that particular route, and you follow the tracks and you find that they end up in the bottom of a big crevice. In the business world, it's other firms, other companies, other teams doing the same thing or doing something and thinking that they know something we don't. So we get a situation like COVID, we see a competitor or another company respond in a certain way and we assume that they have the right answer, and so we just follow suit. And the third is social facilitation. And that really describes the way that in a group situation, when you have a lot of people making decisions, the accountability for those decisions gets spread, and so the perception of risk gets spread. And people tend to take excessive risk or more risk when that accountability is shared. So when you're thinking about crisis response, when you're thinking about dealing with a situation, just run through that list and just make sure that you're not suffering from any of those traps. Okay, so finally, how do we then sort of rebuild our decision model? Sorry, as the slide shows very unresponsive. Third thing, just reducing risk around decision processes. So there are two incredibly important variables in risk reduction. They are people and time. The people piece is really just about understanding that different people respond in different ways to the same situation. If we were in the same building and I was to tell you there was a fire in the building, about a third of you would immediately start to focus on what do we need to do to prevent the spread of the fire, to put the fire out, to protect the building, to protect everything around us. So a solution, an outcome around the fire. About a third of you would start focusing on people. What do we need to make sure everyone's safe? How do we get people out of the way of the fire? And focus on that rather than on containment. And about a third would take an analytical approach. You'd be focused on what do we actually know? How do we make decisions around people, around containment, if we're not sure about the data? What is the information we've got? What's the evidence we've got? Are we sure it's accurate? And the problem is that if you're very focused on the people piece and how we get people out, how we make sure everyone's safe, and I'm very focused on the data piece, making sure the data is right, although both responses are equally valid, equally useful, equally important, we might as well be speaking a different language. And what's been shown is that in conflict situations in organizations, generally speaking, only about 15% of disagreement really comes from fundamental differences of cultural perspective. And only about 20% comes from genuine differences of opinion. 60 to 65% comes from miscommunication. So understanding people's way of interacting with the environment around them is a crucial part in reducing risk in decision making. Second is time, reducing the time scale of a decision. We're hardwired towards action. People want to rush into action. They want to get things, a crisis situation, they want to do something. So they don't spend enough time planning. The trouble is, if you don't plan the action, you end up sort of iterating as you go. You're making it up as you go. The execution window is extended considerably. You spend a lot more time executing. And the more time you spend executing, the more time there is for the context or situation to change. So there's a sort of great little heuristic, if you like, which comes from the construction industry. Think slow, act fast, even in a crisis situation. Take a step back, make sure you've got everything aligned, and then when you act, act quickly. We then need to try and sort of build our own set of heuristics. When we're building heuristics, there are sort of three key factors we need to take into account. What are the search criteria we're going to use? When do we stop searching? And how do we make our decision? So I'm just going to walk you through a really kind of simple example of this. Let's go back to just sort of prior to COVID. We've not had a pandemic before. COVID breaks. We run a small organization. Suddenly everyone needs to work from home. And we need to put an IT system in place and cope with it. We need to make sure everyone's got laptops and that they're all connected. So we need to go out there and we need to choose an IT solution. Search criteria. What do we care about? Well, we're going to look at processing power. We're going to look at working memory. We're going to look at storage, and we're going to look at the cost of computers. What's the stopping criteria? When are we going to stop the search? Well, we're going to stop the search as soon as we've got 4 models that fit the bill roughly. And then selection criteria. How do we make our selection? So here's a really simple heuristic framework. And it depends on speed and accuracy. If we need a really fast decision, we can just select the first satisfactory option. If we need a little bit more accuracy, and we've got a little bit more time, we can take the first best. I'll show you how this works in a minute, but we pick the best option on a specific criteria. If we need more accuracy, we can start to eliminate options one by one. And if we really care more about accuracy than time, we can start to analyze each different option. So let's have a look at this. 4 options, 4 different laptops, 4 inputs down the left, processor speed, RAM, working memory, storage, and cost. If I just pick the first option, option 1, and I go through and say, does it kind of tick the box on all 4 criteria? Is it a sort of a good score or an adequate score, 0? It's not a negative. Yep, option 1, job done. I don't need to look at the others. It's the fastest decision I can make. It's satisfactory. Second one, a little bit more accurate. I care most about processor speed. That is important. Memory is not that important. You know, we're all cloud-based. So I'm going to look across all 4 options based on the processor speed. Yeah, number 2 stands out here. So I'm going to take the first best on that criteria. If I eliminate by aspect, first of all, let's processor speed. Well, option 4 is the weakest. Get rid of it. Working memory, option 2, not so good. Let's get rid of it. I'm left with 2. Option 3, storage. Okay, option 1, not quite as good as option 3. That's the one I'll pick. And then obviously you can see from option 4, if I weight all of the different criteria, I get a different option. So what it shows you here, depending on your need for speed or accuracy, the way you make decisions, the choice architecture you put in place can yield very different results. That's almost it. My final comment is around planning. I don't want to dwell on this because it's such a huge topic in its own right. But also, as so many of you are professional in the crisis management space, you'll all be very familiar with scenario planning. But it is a really important part of the process. And I think there's just one observation I'd like to make. Very often with scenarios and scenario planning, people get sucked into the process of trying to predict the unpredictable. They try to predict events that might happen that are not kind of mainstream. And because they're very difficult, that's very difficult to do. We end up with actually predicting or creating scenarios that's just alternative versions of our mainstream view. The real purpose of scenarios should be to highlight core vulnerabilities. So it's not about the exact scenario, it's exposing the vulnerability, understanding how that can come about, and having processes in place to deal with that vulnerability. I've worked a lot with the Oxford University Scenarios program, and their methodology for me is fabulous. And the way it works is that we map the kind of contextual macro environment, and then we look at all of the different players in the transaction environment, all the stakeholders, decision makers, employees, clients, whatever it may be, and work out how changes in that macro environment will change their behavior. And then in turn, we look at how that impacts our vulnerability. And the effectiveness of this is that the scenarios don't need to be specific. And if I've got time, Jonathan, just for one quick story to illustrate this, that will be my final words. As an example, a real world example, work done with the Oxford team of a company in Manhattan. And they had a series of really sort of high-end chemist shops, styled as sort of old-fashioned apothecaries, way ahead of the competition because of that sort of hands-on customer experience. And they were worried after 9/11 attacks that in the event of a terrorist attack, the client base wouldn't be able to get to their shops. And of course, they couldn't compete with the big players in the online marketplace. Their USP was gone, it disappeared. So they modeled this and they decided what they should do is to move half their inventory to a warehouse outside of Manhattan. And it was a family business, so buy each of the members of the family a moped, And if people couldn't get around, they would just load up their orders and deliver them to people's homes. And COVID hit. Of course, it's nothing like a terrorist scenario, except that it exposed that core vulnerability. People couldn't get to their shops. They were ready. They saw it. They saw that problem. They had the contingency in place. All they had to do was buy their people as well, their people some masks as well as their mopeds, and they did extremely well. They survived extremely well. So just a thought around the scenario planning. That's it for the presentation. Apologies for rushing through it a little bit. It's such a huge topic. We could spend weeks on decision theory, but I hope that's given you just a picture of how we, from a behavioral perspective, think about breaking down problem solving and decision-making processes, isolating the cognitive biases, accepting that heuristics are part of the decision-making process and embracing them, and then building our own heuristics, our own patterns that we can use when we're under pressure. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much. Fascinating. For me, three things, well, many things, but three of the things I've written down that I think are very relevant to crisis management. Think slow, act fast. It's one of our mantras. Don't start doing things until you've started thinking about why. Secondly, I think the present bias was really interesting as it relates to crisis planning as a whole. We're fine now, so why do we need to plan for something that may never happen in the future? Really dangerous bias there. Also, the acceptance bias. Challenge and an alternative view in a crisis management team is good. And if that acceptance bias is too big, then people won't feel able to speak up. I want to have a few closing slides, and Mark, I'm going to send you the questions that have been asked, and we will include those as part of our follow-up. But in terms of looking forward, our next webinar takes place on the 11th of December, which is all about learnings from this year's biggest crises, and also planning for the risks that are on the landscape for 2025. If any of the people on this call have views about which crises they'd like me to take a look at, please feel free to share that. As it's getting nearer to Christmas, I also have 3 copies of Crisis Proof for you to either read or to give as Christmas gifts. So if you reply to the email, which will be coming out later today, if you'd like a copy, then there are 3 that we will be giving away. I guess my final thought on today is also, what can you do in very practical terms to reduce the chances of making some of those decision-making mistakes that Mark talked about earlier? And I would suggest scenario planning, walking through situations and identifying some in-principle decisions in peacetime. That means not every decision is going to be made under pressure. The second thing is to practice under pressure to reduce the amount of stress and strain and pressure that you're feeling in crisis. And thirdly, reflect and act on the cognitive biases and also the beneficial side of heuristics that you have heard about today. Thank you all very much for joining us. As I say, if you have questions or would like further information from either Mark or I, our contact details are here. Thank you for joining us. Mark, once again, thank you to you for such a fascinating insight into how the mind works and how we can actually exert control over the mind and respond more effectively, make better decisions when under pressure. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks.